Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Welcome to Chapter 6, Culture and Communication. This is a really interesting chapter, and I think you're going to get a lot out of it. In your Applied Communication textbook, this is page 199 if you want to follow along. So we're going to define culture. What is culture? Define personal, social, and cultural identities. Summarize non-dominant and dominant identity development, and explain why there's differences in the culture and identity when we look at communication. So culture is an ongoing renegotiation of learned pattern beliefs. It's also attitudes, values, and behavior. It's always changing. It's learned through socialization, and it's patterned into recognizable widespread similarities. An example of this, I'm originally from the South United States, so Alabama, the Mississippi area, and the culture there, of course, is different than what you would see in Washington or the Pacific Northwest. So there's some challenges when I transitioned from, I actually moved to Alaska first. When I transitioned from Alabama to Alaska, I had to learn the culture there and learn how to communicate and respect the culture. I'm not saying that when you encounter someone in a different area, you have to adapt to that culture, but we should respect each other's values and beliefs and make sure we communicate with people in a way that they understand, especially in healthcare. We're there to connect with the patient rather than them connecting with us. So we're the ones being the servant, and we need to make sure we recognize culture and adapt to it. However, they should also respect our culture, as that is not just a sign of respect, but also a sign of dignity. So personal identities, primarily this is connected in our life experiences. You have social identities as well, and that's from social groups in which we're committed, and then cultural identities, social constructed categories that teach us a way of being and acting. About that on page 200. There's some interesting examples, and I like the table of personal, social, and cultural identities that talk about different personal and social things. So personal, here's an example. Personal would be a dog lover. Social would be you're a member of the Humane Society, right? And then cultural would be either you're male or female. A lot of different things in here that you can incorporate into your communication knowledge. So you have identities, right? Ascribed, avowed, dominant, and non-dominant identities. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And that's also on page 200 and 201. You see me you probably hear me moving away from the video a little bit because I'm looking at my book, and hopefully you have your textbook open as well, because that's important. What I'd like to see you do is potentially pause the video and read over it here, and we'll talk about it as time goes on, and that way you can be looking at this in real time. The dominant and non-dominant identities. Dominant identities historically had more resources and influence. Non-dominant, on the other hand, had less influence and resources. It's important to remember that these distinctions are made at the societal level and not the individual level. So most of the time individuals don't have control of this, right? There are obviously exceptions, with people in groups considered non-dominant obtaining more resources and power than a person in a dominant group. However, the overall trend is that difference based on cultural groups that have been institutionalized, and exceptions do not change this fact. So there are many examples of this. I'm sure in society today you can think of many as well. So from the instance that I talked about, make sure you think about that. Document on your own time and learn to work with all types of people, right? And of course, on a societal factor, I'm hopeful that leaders will help remove some of the resource issues that we have with non-dominant identities, which is, of course, more challenging for them. All right, 4 stages of non-dominant development. You have unexamined, conformity, resistance, and integration. And the dominant identity development stages are existent in 5 pieces: unexamined, accepted, resisted, redefined, and integrated. Think about dominant identity. I think about those that have used their privilege to get into potentially maybe jobs that they wouldn't be afforded if they were a non-dominant group. A lot of times you hear dominance based on sex or gender, and of course that is not something that we are striving towards in society today. However, At times you see that, so it's important to be aware of it and to make sure that we do everything we can to make that communication, on an equal playing field for those that are highly resourced and those that are not. And that's something that I think is an ongoing challenge. There's an interesting picture on page 202 as well. Many people that are blind, deaf, of course, use sign language. And from the perspective of those that are deaf, but challenge communicating with others, and they would be considered a non-dominant group. I actually took 3 years of sign language in college because I recognized this, and we had a large group of deaf people on campus, and that was actually very enjoyable to learn some of the, of course, communication styles that deaf people have through sign language, and it's a very interesting form of communication. I also learned a lot about the culture and the challenges that they had to go through on a daily basis just to go, to work or to participate in activities that might be easy or normal for all of us who don't have the same challenges. So it's important to recognize that this exists on a global level, and it's something that we should work to, of course, end to make sure people have the resources they need to be successful and prosperous. 2, of course, the learning objectives are here. Define social constructionist view and identity. Trace this historical development for cultural identities and discuss how each one affects or relates to communication. So we're going to look at constructionism. Kind of a tough way to say it. I sometimes want to say constructivist, but that's not correct. It's constructionism. So it's a view that argues that the self is formed through our interactions with others and in relationship to social, cultural, and political context. This perspective we can see by cultural identities, how they're maintained, and how they change over time. So look at page number 207 and 208. So a lot of different interesting comparisons here for 6.2. So it says social constructionism is a view that argues that the self is formed through our interactions with others. And we just talked about that, right? And there are also other important identities that should be discussed, like religion, age, nationality, and class. Although they are not given their own section, consider how those identities might intersect with the identities discussed next. And we're going to go over, of course, some of the identities that you're well aware of. So we talk about race, right? Race is on page 207. So it's socially constructed category based on differences in appearance, right? Uncertainty about language use affects how we communicate via race, right? And interracial communication code switching involves changing from one way of speaking to another between or within interactions. So race is something that you hear about quite often, right? So therefore, we'll define race as socially constructed category based on differences in appearance. We talked about that. And race, I think it's interesting, in the second paragraph it says, race didn't become a socially and culturally recognized marker until European colonial expansion in the 1500s. So as the Europeans, of course, continued to grow into new territories, race became a factor and, of course, became a challenge. And it's continued to be a challenge that we see today. I'm hopeful that we'll overcome many of the challenges surrounding it and work together in a better way and give people, that deserve the resources the chance to do and be a dominant class, or of course be on equal class as it should be to begin with. And we talked about that dominant versus undominant identity on page 202. But let's look through a couple more. Gender. Actually, going back to race. Page 208, table 6.2, racial classifications in the U.S. Census. Take a look at that. That's really interesting. 1790, there was no category for race, and then all the way up to 2010, the census included 15 racial categories, and an option to write race is not listed on the form. So you can see some of the changes that the United States has gone through over the past, couple hundred years. All right, moving on to gender. Point out one more thing before we move on, especially these last two topics and a couple more we're going to talk about. This lecture is not at all touching the challenges that we go through from a perspective of these classes. So, as we talk about this, I'm just barely hitting the surface. There's a lot more research that you can do, and there's a lot more that needs to be done to improve the challenges that we see. So don't take this as glancing over a challenge or a communication issue that we see in society. It's just there's a lot more that there is to it, and there's a lot more that should be discussed and studied as time goes on. We know about gender, right? There's notions, right, of masculinity and those that are feminine through communication and interactions, and there's some changes there, right, from the perspective of women's rights, gay rights, and transgender rights that you see in society today, much of which you didn't hear about as much in the past. But the thing is that we're able to talk about that more openly now, and are more acceptable of who people are and how they identify. So you can read more about that in page 211 and 212, and there's a lot of information here, and it's actually not anywhere near an amount to consider yourself an expert after reading this. A lot more research that should be done. On page 213 alone, we talk about transgender rights and some of the challenges associated with the transgender community. Transgender, of course, is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity or expression do not match the gender they were assigned with at birth. I'm sure you all are aware of this, but there's a lot of really interesting facts in here that you should read about in order to make sure that we communicate with those who choose a different gender than the ones they were assigned at birth. Some information there, so make sure you review it. I'm trying to move a little quickly because we're about to hit our max here on the lecture. I'll try to keep it under 15 minutes for you guys. Sexuality, right, refers to a person's primary and physical and emotional attraction. So lots of great information here related to that. Table 6.3 on page 214. Really great information here from the perspective of how things have changed all the way up to 2015 and the right for same-sex marriage. I really think that you would learn a lot if you took a look at this table. Again, just touching the surface here. Ability, right? What is your ability based on disability or medical or otherwise? And your ableism, the system that produces a physical or mental standard that is projected as normal and labels deviations as abnormal, resulting in, of course, unequal treatment. A lot of this you've seen improve from the perspective of school and what people go through from society perspective. However, there's still a ways to go. On page 216, you actually see a disabled veteran. Of course, veterans that are disabled, especially those come back from wartime, have a challenge, right, with being able to find jobs that work for them. However, I'm hoping that this improves over time, as many of the other challenges that we've uncovered through gender, race, sexuality, as well. Hopeful that those improve too. So, moving on to 6.3, there's another table for 6.2 from the perspective of ableism that talks about ability, identity, and communication, and it goes all the way back to 400 BC to 2015. 6.3, we're talking about intercultural communication. So intercultural communication, I think, is an important point because you have a dialectic approach and then dichotomies. So dialectic is a relationship between two opposing concepts that constantly push and pull one another. And dichotomies is a dualistic way of thinking that highlight opposites, reducing the ability to see graduations that exist between concepts. Time's running a little out here, so we talked about dichotomy. Read about that on page 220. And there's a lot of different intercultural dialect that captures the interplay between pattern behaviors learned from cultural groups. Really interesting table on 6.1 you should take a look at as well. There are privileges associated with this, which are challenges from the perspective of what we've been through on a cultural basis. So take a look at that as well. This is a very complex chapter, and it takes a lot of effort to understand. However, I hope that you read it, and I think you'll become more educated after you do so. However, it's just touching the surface. I appreciate you letting me walk you through it, and I look forward to more discussion and more work on these things.